No, seriously, what's the trouble?
It's my cousin.
Wilma? What's the matter with her?
She has a, well, I guess you'd call it a delusion. You know her uncle, Uncle Ira.
Sure.
Mas, she's got herself thinking he isn't her uncle.
How do you mean, that they're not really related?
No, she thinks he's an imposter or something, someone who only looks like Ira.
Have you seen him?
I just came from there.
Well, is he Uncle Ira or isn't he Uncle Ira?
What if I told you one of the most paranoid and influential films in history was never meant to be political at all? In 1956, Invasion of the Body Snatchers terrified audiences with its chilling vision of a small town quietly, systematically taken over by perfect, soulless, emotionless duplicates. It was a waking nightmare that felt a little too close to real life in the paranoia-gripped world of Cold War America. Shot fast, cheap, and under intense studio pressure, it accidentally captured the deepest fears of an entire generation. The fear of conformity, of quiet control, and of the horrifying loss of individual identity. The result was not just a B-movie. It became one of the most important and influential sci-fi thrillers ever made. These are 16 bizarre and unbelievable facts about Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the film that started as a low-budget thriller and ended up defining what true paranoia on screen really looks and feels like. A sci-fi classic shot in a desperate, 23-day sprint director Don Siegel didn't have the luxury of money, time, or even the studio's faith on his side. All he had was grit and a ticking clock. The entire, complex movie was filmed in a frantic and exhausting sprint of only 23 days, a schedule that would have broken most modern productions. Every single scene had to be meticulously planned, blocked, lit, and shot with a kind of military precision. There was absolutely no budget for reshoots or the luxury of multiple retakes. If the camera rolled and no one tripped over a line or a piece of equipment, the take was printed and the crew moved on. Siegel's famously no-nonsense and efficient directing style turned this harsh necessity into a powerful, artistic choice. The fast, almost rushed pacing of the production gave the final film a raw, nervous, and almost breathless energy that perfectly matched its story of creeping, unstoppable paranoia. When you watch the film, you can actually feel the palpable tension of a crew racing against the clock, trying to finish their work before the studio could pull the plug. What began as a low-budget rush job ended up perfectly capturing the very urgency of the pod invasion itself. Fast, silent, and terrifyingly efficient. The alien pods were cheaper than a new car. Those eerie, otherworldly, seed-like pods. The ones that slowly gestate and then spawn the lifeless, foam-covered human duplicates. Looked like a piece of expensive and terrifying movie magic to audiences in 1956. In reality, they were a triumph of low-budget ingenuity, built with a total budget that was less than the cost of a new car at the time. The entire special effects budget for the film was a minuscule $15,000, and a significant portion of that went to creating the pods. Crafted by the brilliant production designer Ted Howarth, each pod was painstakingly handmade from a combination of papier-mâché, latex, and lined with a strange, almost organic-looking fabric. They were then filled with gels and foam to make them appear to pulse and breathe under the studio lights, and constantly doused with fog and smoke to hide their imperfections. They were incredibly fragile, messy, and would constantly collapse or melt under the intense heat of the 1950s studio lamps. The crew often had to work overnight, frantically rebuilding the pods just to be ready for the next day's filming. As cheap as they were, those fake, fragile pods became iconic, a powerful and enduring proof that true cinematic terror doesn't require a big budget, just a brilliant and unforgettable idea. The film was almost called Sleep No More. Before it became known by its iconic and sensational title, the film had a very different and much more subtle name, Sleep No More. The director, Don Siegel, and the writer, Daniel Mainwaring, fought hard for that title. They believed it perfectly captured the story's eerie and unique mix of physical exhaustion and creeping psychological paranoia. The characters in the film are literally terrified to fall asleep, knowing that's when they are most vulnerable to being replaced. But the studio, Allied Artists, a studio known for B-movies and exploitation flicks, wanted something flashier, something that would sell tickets in big, bold, screaming letters on a 1950s movie marquee. The studio executives overruled the creative team, choosing the much more lurid and sensational title, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, instead. Siegel reportedly hated the new title at first, calling it cheap sensationalism that undermined the film's serious tone. Yet, the title worked brilliantly. Audiences couldn't resist the lurid promise of an alien invasion happening right next door, inside their friends and neighbors. Ironically, the very title that the director was forced to accept became one of the most unforgettable and influential in the history of science fiction. The studio tried to erase the film's dark, hopeless ending. Don Siegel's original, intended ending for the film was brutally, unforgettably bleak. The final image was meant to be that of Dr. Miles Bennell, having finally escaped his town, standing desperately on a busy highway, screaming a warning directly at the camera, at us, the audience. You're next! They're already here. You're next. It was a gut punch of pure, unfiltered hopelessness, a final, terrifying statement that the invasion had already succeeded and humanity was lost. But when the studio executives at Allied Artists saw this ending, they panicked. They thought the film was far too grim, too nihilistic, and that audiences would leave the theater feeling depressed and angry. They demanded a new opening and ending to soften the blow and provide at least a glimmer of hope. They forced Siegel to add the hospital framing scenes, which turned the entire story into a flashback that Miles is recounting to a psychiatrist. This new ending, which shows the authorities finally believing him and taking action, completely changes the tone. Siegel always maintained that the studio had ruined his perfect, terrifying ending. But even with that forced compromise, Invasion of the Body Snatchers still left viewers deeply shaken, walking out of theaters and looking at their loved ones, wondering if anyone around them was truly human anymore. Theaters turned their lobbies into eerie alien nurseries. When Invasion of the Body Snatchers hit theaters, the studio knew they had something uniquely eerie and unsettling on their hands, and they leaned all the way into the paranoia with their marketing, to hype the film and create a sense of unease before the movie even started. Cinemas across America filled their lobbies with life-sized papier-mâché replicas of the alien seed pods. They used eerie, green lighting and placed cardboard cutouts of the film's stars, frozen in mid-scream, around the lobby. Some of the more ambitious theater exhibitors even hired staff to dress as pod people, with blank, emotionless expressions, and had them silently wander through the lobby, creeping out moviegoers as they bought their popcorn. It was part brilliant marketing stunt, part psychological warfare, and it worked perfectly. Crowds lined up around the block, buzzing with rumors that the pods in the lobby might actually move or open. It was low-budget, grassroots promotion at its finest, the kind of practical and immersive showmanship that made 1950s sci-fi feel terrifyingly real, even before the lights went down. The film almost had a famous, authoritative narrator before the cameras started rolling. The film's producer, Walter Wanger, wanted to add a touch of prestige and gravitas to his B-movie. His idea was to include a dramatic news-style prologue, narrated by one of the most famous and trusted voices in America, either the legendary filmmaker Orson Welles or the famed and respected broadcast journalist Edward R. Murrow. The plan was for them to introduce the true story of the pod invasion as if it were a chilling news bulletin, a special report on the end of the world. This would have brilliantly blurred the line between the film's fiction and the audience's reality, turning the movie into a mock documentary about humanity's quiet downfall, similar in style to Welles's own infamous War of the Worlds radio broadcast. But the director, Don Siegel, absolutely hated the idea. He believed that the story's power came from the audience discovering the horror along with the characters. Adding an all-knowing narrator at the beginning, he argued, would completely break the illusion of creeping paranoia. The proposal was scrapped before a single frame was shot. Welles and Murrow never lent their famous voices to the project, but the film ultimately didn't need them. Its creeping silent fear spoke loudly enough on its own. Real nights were used to create real, gritty darkness. In the 1950s, most Hollywood night scenes were faked. They were shot during the day, using a technique called day for night, which involved using special filters and underexposing the film stock to create the illusion of darkness. But director Don Siegel, in his relentless pursuit of realism, refused to cheat. He demanded that every single nighttime scene in Invasion of the Body Snatchers be shot at actual night. No shortcuts, no tricks. It was a brutal and expensive choice for a low-budget film. The cast and crew worked through freezing California nights, battling wind, moisture, and sheer exhaustion. Lighting rigs had to be constantly rebuilt in the darkness, and the film's tiny budget didn't allow for extra setups or costly overtime. Still, Siegel believed that real shadows and real darkness created a sense of real fear that could not be faked. The gamble paid off spectacularly. Those deep, grainy, and authentically dark nighttime shots gave the movie its unique and haunting realism. It created a world that looked just like yours, but darker, emptier, and always just one step away from being completely and silently replaced. The on-set and on-screen phone lines went dead in the movie. One of the first and most chilling signs that something is terribly wrong in the town of Santa Mira is when the characters discover that no one can reach the outside world. The phone lines are suddenly and mysteriously dead, cutting the town off completely from the rest of humanity. It was a perfect and terrifying symbol of the characters' growing isolation and paranoia. But in a strange and eerie twist of fate, the real production faced the exact same problem. The film was shot partly in the quiet, remote hills of Sierra Madre, California, a location where communication lines in the 1950s were notoriously unreliable. Crew members on location struggled to coordinate with the studio executives back in Los Angeles, often working for long hours without any phone contact or even clear radio communication. That strange and unintended overlap, a story about a town completely cut off from humanity, being filmed in a location that literally lost touch with the outside world, added a layer of unintended, almost supernatural realism to the production. On and off screen, the town of Santa Mira was truly and utterly alone. The tight 23-day schedule still ran long, fueling studio panic. Don Siegel was a director who prided himself on his speed and efficiency, a reputation that was essential for working in the low-budget B-movie world. But even with his incredibly tight 23-day shooting plan, Invasion of the Body Snatchers still ran 3 days over schedule. The reason was a combination of the endless, difficult night shoots and the unpredictable weather in the hills of Sierra Madre. Equipment would freeze in the cold night air. Unexpected fog would roll in and ruin the lighting setups. And the exhausted actors were often shooting until dawn just to capture a few usable takes. The studio, allied artists, which was already nervous about the film's dark tone, began to panic as the costs started to climb with each passing day of overtime. But Siegel, a notoriously stubborn director, pushed through, refusing to compromise the film's eerie and realistic atmosphere for the sake of a few extra dollars. "You can't fake fear," he was known to say, and he meant it. The sheer exhaustion you see on the actors' faces in those final desperate late-night scenes wasn't just acting. It was the real toll of a grueling and unforgiving shoot. Critics initially slept on the film for decades. When Invasion of the Body Snatchers premiered in 1956, most mainstream critics completely shrugged it off. The film was unceremoniously released as the bottom half of a double feature, often paired with lighter B-movies, and many reviewers dismissed it as just another forgettable alien flick in an already crowded sci-fi market. Even its own studio, Allied Artists, treated it like filler content rather than a prestige picture. But over time, that quiet and unassuming release became a crucial part of its enduring legend. Audiences kept talking about the movie, about its eerie realism, its suffocating tension, and its gut-punch ending that hit a little too close to home in the paranoid 1950s. Word of mouth turned it into a cult classic. By the 1970s, a new generation of film scholars and critics were re-evaluating it, calling it one of the most defining and brilliant works of Cold War cinema. The original critics may have missed it at first, but the pod people didn't stay buried for long. They crept back quietly, generation after generation, until the world finally caught up to their genius. The hidden political message that was never intended. When Invasion of the Body Snatchers first came out, audiences couldn't stop arguing about what it all really meant. Its story of a population being silently replaced by emotionless, conformist duplicates was a perfect Rorschach test for the political anxieties of the 1950s. Was it a conservative, anti-communist warning about losing your individuality to a soulless collective hive mind? Or was it a liberal critique of McCarthyism, showing how a culture of fear and paranoia turns people into identical, obedient, and finger-pointing shells? Even Jack Finney, the author of the original story, denied any specific political intent. He claimed it was simply about people losing their essential humanity, not about Washington or any particular ideology. The director, Don Siegel, remained coy, later admitting that every viewer saw their own fears reflected in the story, and that's precisely what made it so powerful. The truth is that no one can fully agree on its meaning, and that is the genius of the film, whether you see it as a political allegory, a commentary on social conformity, or just a pure, terrifying nightmare. Body Snatchers holds up a mirror that still feels uncomfortably and universally real. A film too serious and intelligent for its own studio. The studio that produced the film, Allied artists, never really understood what they had. When the executives saw Don Siegel's first dark and brooding cut, they panicked. It was too bleak, too quiet, and felt too much like a serious psychological drama. They had been expecting a crowd-pleasing alien spectacle with more monsters and action, not a subtle and terrifying nightmare about identity and fear. So, in a classic case of studio interference, they stepped in. They were the ones who demanded the addition of a narration to explain the plot, and they were the ones who forced the creation of the hospital framing story to give the film a more hopeful and less ambiguous ending. Siegel fought back fiercely, arguing that the film's ambiguity was the entire point, that the true horror came from the terrifying uncertainty of not knowing if the invasion could ever be stopped. The studio won that battle, but not the war. Even with their added tacked-on optimism, the core of the movie's tone stayed chillingly hopeless. What Allied artists feared would confuse and alienate audiences instead made cinematic history. A B-movie that thought too deeply and scared too intelligently. Santa Mira was just Los Angeles in a clever disguise. The sleepy, idyllic California town of Santa Mira, where neighbors smile by day and turn into soulless, emotionless pod people by night doesn't actually exist. The film's eerie and perfectly rendered small-town backdrop was cleverly stitched together from a variety of real locations in Sierra Madre and on the backlots of Los Angeles studios, all artfully disguised to feel like one single, cohesive, and claustrophobic place. Storefronts were redressed overnight to play different businesses in different scenes. Fake street signs for Santa Mira were bolted to real lampposts. And the same few blocks of a single street were often shot from multiple different angles to make the small town seem much larger and more sprawling than it actually was. Even the iconic winding highway where Dr. Bennell makes his final desperate stand was filmed on a real road just outside of Los Angeles. That expert mix of real locations and artificial studio constructions gave Santa Mira its unique and uncanny feel. It was familiar, yet slightly wrong. It looked just like the world you knew, but hollowed out and empty. The perfect, unsettling home for a silent, creeping invasion. The real horror was not monsters, but a lack of emotion. Forget laser guns and bug-eyed monsters. The true enduring terror in Invasion of the Body Snatchers came from something far simpler and much more psychologically disturbing: a complete and total lack of emotion. The pod people were perfect physical replicas of their human counterparts, but on the inside, they were utterly empty. There was no love, no anger, no jealousy, no guilt, just a calm, rational, and terrifyingly efficient drive to survive and spread. That simple idea terrified 1950s audiences because it was a direct and powerful mirror of their own real-life social anxieties. Post-war America was a culture obsessed with conformity. The same jobs in the same corporations, the same houses in the same suburbs, the same smiles, the same values. The film hit a raw nerve by showing what happens when that drive for individuality disappears completely. You're still you on the outside, but you don't feel anything anymore. It was a form of horror so subtle and so profound that it didn't need blood or violence to be effective. Just a quiet, empty stare from a familiar face that was suddenly and chillingly void of a soul. Pod people became a part of the English language. Invasion of the Body Snatchers didn't just change the science fiction genre, it literally changed the English language. In the years after the film's release, the term pod people slipped out of the movie theater and into everyday conversation, becoming a powerful and widely understood cultural shorthand. The phrase was used to describe anyone who seemed emotionless, robotic, or who appeared to be blindly conforming to a group ideology without any independent thought. By the 1960s and 70s, journalists were calling politicians and their followers pod people, and cultural critics used the term to mock the growing uniformity of American suburbia. It's one of the rare and remarkable moments when a B-movie idea becomes a permanent part of a nation's cultural DNA. Even today, the phrase still shows up in politics, in memes, and on late-night talk shows as a quick and effective way to describe the fear of losing one's humanity in a world that so often demands sameness. The ultimate irony is that a cheap, quickly made movie from a small studio created a metaphor that has lasted for nearly 70 years. From B-movie filler to the National Film Registry Hall of Fame, what began as a modest, low-budget studio thriller that was largely dismissed by critics ended up being immortalized among the greatest films ever made. In 1994, Invasion of the Body Snatchers was officially selected by the United States Library of Congress to be preserved in the National Film Registry. This prestigious honor recognizes films as being culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. The film now sits in the registry alongside undisputed masterpieces like Citizen Kane and Casablanca. Not bad for a movie that was once dismissed as simple drive-in filler. The honors didn't stop there. The American Film Institute later ranked it among the top 10 greatest sci-fi films of all time, and its profound influence can be seen in everything from Alien to Get Out. Directors, critics, and fans still cite it as one of the purest and most effective examples of cinematic paranoia ever made. It's the ultimate twist ending for the film's own story. A movie about emotionless conformity became one of the most distinctive, celebrated, and enduringly unique films in the history of Hollywood. For a film made on a shoestring budget and initially dismissed as pulp, Invasion of the Body Snatchers became one of cinema's greatest and most profound happy accidents. It was a movie that brilliantly and almost unconsciously defined the paranoia of its time, without ever explicitly meaning to. Beneath its low-budget sets and its gooey, papier-mâché pods was a perfect and terrifying reflection of everything Cold War America was afraid to admit about itself. The fear of blending in, of losing yourself, of waking up one morning and realizing the world you know no longer feels human. It wasn't the loudest or the flashiest sci-fi film of its time. It was the quietest, the most insidious, and that's precisely why it still gets under your skin today. It doesn't scream at you. It whispers a terrifying and timeless warning. They're already here. So which of these strange facts surprised you the most? Let me know in the comments. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to help more classic film fans discover the stories hiding behind Hollywood's most haunting nightmares.